What's up, Ninja Nerds? In this video today, we're going to be talking about body cavities and serosal membranes. This is going to be a very basic kind of introduction topic to anatomy. So when we get started into this, what I really want you guys to do so that really you guys can understand this kind of video is go down the description box below. If you do that, there's a link to our website where we have some awesome notes, some awesome illustrations that I think will be very, very helpful to follow along with me. Also, if you guys really do like this video, it helps you, it makes sense, please support us. And one of the best ways that you can do that is by hitting that like button, commenting down in the comments section, and please subscribe. It goes a long way. But without further ado, let's kind of get into and start crack-a-lacking on talking about body cavities and serosal membranes. Really, this is supposed to be kind of an introductory topic in the sense that when we talk about body cavities, we can obviously dive into these way more in detail and go through all the different complexities and different vessels and nerves and organs, etc., that's involved in a particular body cavity. But let's be kind of like basic, right? In the sense that when we talk about body cavities, we can really divide it into a dorsal body cavity and a ventral body cavity. There is other body cavities if you really wanted to think about it, but we don't really care too much about those, not to kind of pass them off to the side, but your nasal cavity, your oral cavity, those are other types of cavities, middle ear cavity. But when we talk about these are the ones that are relatively pertinent. So dorsal body cavity, again, dorsal referring to towards the back, right? So this is going to be on the back side. And really there's two particular cavities that are very significant to the dorsal body cavity. You guys know what that is? It's the cranial cavity. What do you think is sitting inside of that big old skull? It's the brain, right? So the cranial cavity primarily holds the brain. And then on top of that, we also have the vertebral cavity, and that's just a continuation of the cranial cavity down the dorsal aspect of the individual. So here we'd have the brain tissue, and then moving down, so you'd have the actual cerebrum, the cerebellum, parts of the brainstem, and then extending down would be the spinal cord. So the vertebral cavity would actually contain what? The spinal cord, okay? Whereas the brain is going to be primarily housed within the cranial cavity. Now that's the one big body cavity, there's the dorsal body cavity. Again, we'll go into more detail on all the different makeup and components of the brain, as well as all the different makeup and components of the spinal cord. If you guys want to know more about that, go into our neurophysiology playlist and watch all of that. But let's talk about the next one. On the ventral body cavity, so ventral, anterior are the kind of synonyms, and then same thing, dorsal, posterior. So dorsal, posterior meaning kind of towards the back. And then anterior ventral means kind of towards the front. In this situation, the ventral body cavity is made up of the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. Let's briefly talk about the thoracic cavity. So if you look at the thoracic cavity, what really kind of is the separating factor between the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity down here is this muscular structure there. What's that called? The diaphragm. So the diaphragm is going to be kind of that imaginary kind of separative structure here that separates the abdominal pelvic cavity from the thoracic cavity. Now, when we talk about the thoracic cavity, there is actually a couple different cavities inside of that thoracic cavity. So imagine here, this whole thing is the thoracic cavity. All of this, which I'm kind of like dotting right here. All that I'm dotting right here is the thoracic cavity. But inside of the thoracic cavity is a couple different structures. One is going to be this one here called the pleural cavity. So you have two pleural cavities, one pleural cavity, two pleural cavities. We'll talk about what that's made up of in just a second. Then you have something called the mediastinum, and you have something called the superior mediastinum and the inferior mediastinum. The superior mediastinum we don't really care too much about for this topic. We'll get into more of the detail of the mediastinum in future lectures. But the inferior mediastinum we actually do care about because there's a special structure that's actually located in the middle portion of the inferior mediastinum. So imagine, inferior mediastinum is down here. Then I turn the patient towards the side. You have an anterior, a middle, and a posterior inferior mediastinum. In the middle part of that mediastinum, the inferior mediastinum, is going to be what? A structure called the pericardial cavity. Let's talk about those really quick. So again, here we have our two pleural cavities. We have a superior inferior mediastinum, but in the inferior mediastinum, if you were to imagine it like this, imagine here is the anterior and posterior view. We have up here is the superior mediastinum, and then down here, this whole component here is the inferior mediastinum. It's sectioned into anterior middle, and posterior. I only care about the middle one. So we're going to zoom in and talk about what's in that. So if we come down here, we'll see here in the pleural cavity, we have two pleural cavities. Here's one pleural cavity, here's two pleural cavities. What does it house? It houses the lungs, my friends. So this is going to house the lungs. But you know what's really interesting? Lungs, the viscera, right, of that particular cavity is covered by very special membranes. We didn't talk about the membranes in the dorsal cavity because there's more specific things that we'll talk about those later called the meninges, right? So you know there's the meninges of the brain, the meninges of the spinal cord. Those are some of the coverings. For the pleural cavity and for the mediastinum, specifically the middle mediastinum, there is a very specific type of tissue. It's called a kind of a serosal, serosa basically. It's an epithelial tissue with a little bit of loose connective tissue. And what it does is there's two layers to this. One clings to the actual viscera of that cavity. In this case, the lungs. And then there's another one that clings to the wall of that cavity. So it clings to the wall of that cavity. And if you notice something, it keeps the whole kind of like cavity continuous with one another, if you will. And it creates something very interesting. So what is this? So here we have the lungs, right? But this tissue here, this tissue right here that's clinging to the lungs, this one, that serosal tissue, we call this a visceral part of the serosa. But since it's the visceral part of that serous tissue that's clinging inside of the actual lung in the pleural cavity, we call this the visceral pleura. So it's called the visceral pleura. So the visceral pleura is the serosa that's clinging to the lung tissue in the pleural cavity. The one that's actually clinging to the wall of the pleural cavity is called the parietal pleura. So what I want you to associate is with the wall of the cavity, parietal, with the organ of the cavity, visceral. So this is parietal pleura. One last thing is if you look between, so here in between the actual visceral and parietal pleura is this like little cavity, if you will. What is this called? What is this cavity here? This cavity is called the pleural cavity, or the pleural space. And inside of that pleural cavity contains a little bit of fluid called serosal fluid. So inside of the pleural cavity, what I want you to remember contains a little bit of fluid called pleural fluid or a serosal fluid. And it's basically made by the visceral and the parietal pleura. And what it's supposed to do is when your lungs inhale, when you inhale, you actually expand the lungs, and whenever you exhale, you kind of deflate the lungs. This fluid allows for a lubricating kind of covering over that visceral and parietal pleura. So when they rub up against one another, it reduces friction. So one of the big things to take away from this fluid is that this fluid reduces friction between the layers. And this is going to be the same with every other kind of cavity. So that's the big thing for the pleural cavity. Now, mediastinum, as I told you, if we really kind of divide it, there's the superior and there's the inferior mediastinum. Then from the inferior, there's the anterior, there's the middle, and there's the posterior. I don't want to get into the depths of this, all the contents in the superior, the anterior, and the posterior. I want to focus this lecture specifically on the middle mediastinum. And in the middle mediastinum is another very specific cavity. And this cavity in the middle mediastinum, so let's actually be very specific. In the mediastinum, which one? The middle mediastinum of the inferior compartment of it. In this, there's the heart, right? There's the heart. This is going to be the what? The heart. And sometimes even some of the great structures coming off of the heart, like the aorta, the pulmonary structures. But one of the big things is there's, again, this tissue that clings nicely to the heart. Clings really, really nicely to the heart. Inside of this cavity. You know what this cavity is called? It's called the pericardial cavity. It's called the pericardial cavity. You would say, oh, it's the middle mediastinum. Technically, yes. But in the middle mediastinum is the heart, and then again, this layer clinging to the heart, what would you call that? The visceral pericardium. And then you have one that clings to the wall of this cavity. Clings to the wall of this cavity. That's the parietal pericardium. So the middle mediastinum contains the heart. And again, the cavity that this heart is sitting in, you would think, oh, it's the middle mediastinum. We actually call it the pericardial cavity. And you can actually kind of look at this in this sense. What's this layer here called, my friends? This is the parietal pericardium. Parietal pericardium. Now let me show you guys something to make sense of this. What's this one here? The visceral pericardium. And then lastly, what is this layer? What is this right here in between? The pericardial cavity. This is the pericardial cavity or space. And the same concept, what was this cavity here? The pleural cavity. What's this cavity right here? The pericardial cavity. What sits in the pericardial cavity? The heart. What sits in the pleural cavity? The lungs. What's the layer that clings to the heart and the lungs? The visceral pericardium and visceral pleura, which is the one that clings to the actual wall of the cavity of the actual pericardium and of the pleural cavity. The parietal pericardium and the parietal pleura. And what's the cavity between the visceral and parietal pericardium? The pericardial cavity. And what's the layer that's actually going to be between the visceral and parietal pleura? The pleural cavity. What's actually contained in this? Serous fluid. So again, same concept here. What do I find in this? Serosal fluid or serous fluid. And what is that supposed to do? Reduce friction, right? So that whenever the heart is actually contracting and relaxing, it doesn't rub up against the actual two layers. That's the concept of the thoracic cavity. Now, my friends, let's talk about the last cavity called the abdominopelvic cavity. All right, my friends, so now we move on to the last cavity here, which is going to be the abdominopelvic cavity. So again, we have the dorsal body cavity, which is made up of the cranial cavity containing the brain, the vertebral cavity containing the spinal cord. Again, we have the two components of the ventral body cavity, which is the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity, separated by the diaphragm. Again, within the thoracic cavity, you have what? The pleural cavity, which contains the lungs, lining the walls, parietal pleura, lining the organ, visceral pleura. The cavity between it is the pleural cavity containing serous fluid that helps to reduce friction. Then you have another two cavities inside of the thoracic cavity called the superior and inferior mediastinum. Don't worry about the superior, but in the inferior we have anterior, middle, posterior. In the middle mediastinum we have another cavity called the pericardial cavity, which houses the heart. The lining or the serosal lining that clings to the heart is the visceral pericardium. The one that clings to the wall is the parietal pericardium. The cavity between is the pericardial cavity containing serosal fluid, which reduces friction. Boom shakalaka. Now we got the abdominopelvic cavity, which again, we separate this by the, what's this structure here called? The diaphragm. The diaphragm. That's just how it helps me to spell it. But from that point down, generally, some textbooks will say until you get to like the pelvic brim. So until you get to like the pelvic brim area, if you will, that may be somewhat of the separating structure between kind of the abdominal part and the pelvic part, if you will. But that's an imaginary kind of like line. But here is your abdominal pelvic cavity. In the same concept, there are so many organs that are present inside of the abdominal pelvic cavity. We're not going to go through all of that. We'll do more of that when we get into the actual GI system and we talk about some of the abdominal cavity contents more in a gross anatomy, a deeper detail. But for the basic concept here, within the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have a bunch of different organs. And what I really want you to remember out of this is, again, the lining. Here, let's say we have some type of GI organ, right? Whatever it may be. Here's going to be some type of GI organ. That could be the stomach. That could be the small intestines. That could be part of the large intestine. Whatever it may be. The layer of tissue that clings to the organ here in the abdominal pelvic cavity is called the visceral peritoneum. Visceral peritoneum. And then the lining of tissue that clings to the wall of the abdominal pelvic cavity is called the parietal peritoneum. Now, let's write these down here. So again, we have the one that clings to the wall, the parietal, and again, it is the peritoneum. So you should be able to take this term, peritoneum, and determine abdominal pelvic. Pleura, pleural cavity, and then pericardial within the pericardial cavity. parietal, wall, visceral, organ, clinging to the organ. The other one is this one here, which is clinging to the actual organ itself. This is the visceral peritoneum, the visceral peritoneum. And then lastly, you have the cavity between the parietal and the visceral peritoneum. And what's that called? The peritoneal cavity. And again, what is contained within the peritoneal cavity, my friends? Serous fluid. So that the layers of the parietal and the visceral peritoneum don't rub up and cause a lot of friction between one another. So there is a nice serous fluid contained within the peritoneal cavity. One last thing, and we're going to keep it as simple as that, is that sometimes you may think, well, these things just look like they're too far apart, Zach. In comparison to the lungs and in comparison to the pericardial cavity, it just looks like this thing's just flopping around everywhere inside of this cavity. There is something that really helps to keep the actual organ kind of suspended within inside of the abdominal pelvic cavity. And this structure actually clings kind of like a little connection, a little bridging connection between the visceral and the parietal peritoneum. And it helps the organ to kind of stay suspended within the abdominal pelvic cavity. Do you know what this is called? This is called here, just like a little guy here, whoop. This here is called a mesentery. This is called a mesentery, and that actually is somewhat important, but again, we'll get into this more in detail in the abdominal cavity, specifically gross anatomy, but that is the other structure that helps to really kind of keep it suspended within the actual abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, abdominal pelvic cavity, we now know the layer that clings to the organ, the layer that clings to the wall, the actual cavity between. We know the separating structure here between the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity, and the imaginary line, if you will, between the abdominal and the pelvic cavity being the pelvic brim. So the last part here is really taking the abdominal pelvic cavity, and really what this is important for, this next concept, is utilizing terminology that you're going to come across a lot throughout anatomy and physiology. And so we use quadrant systems really to help us to define what organs would we suspect to actually be involved if there's pain in this particular area. Or if we're actually going to be kind of looking in this particular area for certain anatomy, if I were to imagine in this particular space what organs would be there. So we utilize this next concept of quadrant systems for both anatomists, use the 9-quadrant system, and then usually clinicians prefer the 4-quadrant system. So the 4-quadrant system is easier than you can ever imagine, right? So what we do is we just take a line and we go right across the umbilicus and then we come right down the midline. I'm a little bit off there, but that's about the way that we would go about this. So we take a line, a horizontal line that goes right from left to right through the navel or through the umbilicus and then right down the midline of the patient, okay? And this separates this into 4 quadrants. We call this the right upper quadrant, which usually contains things most pertinent like the liver, the gallbladder, parts of your right kidney and right adrenal gland, maybe even beginning part of the duodenum. Then over here we have the left upper quadrant, containing parts of the body of the stomach, containing the spleen, containing the left kidney, the left adrenal, right? Then we have the right lower quadrant, containing things like the appendix, the cecum, parts of the ascending colon, the reproductive organs like the fallopian tubes, the right ureter, right? And then you have the left lower quadrant, containing things like the descending colon, containing things like the left fallopian tube, the left ureter, right? Things to that effect. So that's a really important system that clinicians prefer. And it helps to determine if a patient has right upper quadrant abdominal pain, we think, oh, could it be the liver, could it be the gallbladder? If they have right lower quadrant pain, could it be the appendix? Is it left lower quadrant pain? Could they have diverticulosis from a sigmoid colon type of involvement? Or if they're lower quadrants, could they have something going on with their actual fallopian tubes or their ovaries? Left upper quadrant, do they have something going on with their spleen? Right, so those are things that we can help to localize particular organs. But anatomists prefer another method. And this is a really important one that I want you to remember. So what we do is we take an imaginary line and we go around the level of like the 9th rib. So this would say 9th rib. And then we go about the level of the kind of the iliac crest area. And then what we do is we go down the midline portion of the clavicles and the midline portion of the clavicles. And what this does is this separates this into 9 quadrants that anatomists love to use. So again, you have 9th rib, then you have usually like the iliac, kind of like crest area. And then you go the midline portion of the clavicles and the midline portion of the clavicle. And this will kind of develop this system here. And what we do is we give these particular names, right? So on these sides, we call this would be the right, this is the right hypochondriac region, which will contain lots, particularly like liver and biliary tree. This one here would be the left hypochondriac region. And this would contain things like what? More specifically, things like the spleen and things like the left adrenal and maybe things like the body of the stomach. This one right here would be the epigastric region, because usually the epigastric region is going to be, again, parts where maybe there's a lot of stomach problems, okay? So it's above the stomach. So maybe there's a lot of stomach problems going on here, so some type of problem with that. Then we go here, which is usually, if you think about it, from the 9th rib, this usually starts at the level of like L1. And then it usually goes down to about L5 level. So if you think about it, from this part here to this part here is all of the lumbar vertebrae. So this would be the right lumbar region, containing things like the ascending colon, the kidney, the ureter. This over here would be the left lumbar, containing things like the descending colon, the left kidney, the left ureter. Here, this is actually going to be what? So when you think about this one, we can actually call this the umbilical region, right? We can call this the umbilical region. So the umbilical region. So we'll call this the umbilical region. Then we go down here. So we're at the iliac crest and down. So we're at the iliac, or we're in the inguinal area. The inguinal area. So we call this the right iliac, or also referred to as the inguinal region. And this is going to contain things like the appendix. This is going to contain things like the cecum. This will contain things like the fallopian tubes and the ovaries. Over here is the left inguinal. This will contain things like the left fallopian tube. This will contain things like the sigmoid colon, right? And then the last part here is the hypogastric. The hypogastric, or sometimes referred to as pubic region. Okay, because that's going to be below the stomach region. And again, this would be containing particular things like the bladder, maybe even the uterus in particular, like females, right? So those are things to consider as well. So this is the things that I think would end off the abdominal pelvic cavity. And again, the big thing to take away from this entire lecture is knowing what are the major cavities: dorsal, ventral. Dorsal contains cranial and vertebral. Know the organs and contained with that one. Ventral body cavity contains thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. In the thoracic cavity, there's the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, it's just a bunch of different organs in there. But the way that we can really kind of define the organs in that particular abdominal pelvic cavity can be utilizing quadrant systems, such as the 9-quadrant system: right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, right lumbar, right inguinal, left inguinal, right, or iliac, epigastric, umbilical, hypogastric, knowing the organs contained. Or the 4-quadrant system preferred by clinicians: right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant. And then lastly, knowing the serosal membranes that cling to the wall of that cavity: parietal, clinging to the organs; visceral, and the cavity between that contains serosal fluid. That's the things that I want you guys to take away from this, and I hope it made sense. As always, engineers, until next time.